Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be back at Oakmont. I see some friends here from previous talks I've given here at the Burger Center. Well, I've got a very brief time to cover about 3,000 years of the beginning of civilization. It's going to be a very high altitude flyover. So bear with me. The idea is an introduction to get everybody, to sort of get these empires in place chronologically. And we can get a sense of how things flowed very briefly and how they developed one after the other and what led to what. This is, of course, a very succinct summary of a longer course I give on Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, that's what it means. Mesopotamia, it's Greek, the land between the rivers. And which rivers do I mean? I mean the Tigris and the Euphrates, which start in Turkey, and mostly what we're talking about is what is modern-day Iraq, a place you may know something of. And the rivers come together here and flow into the Arabian Gulf. However, in the old days, they did not come together because this is all new. The old shoreline was up there. It's been that much has silted in. 120 miles has silted in on that terrain. The rivers flood, which is a disastrous thing and a beneficial thing. You may know the Nile floods allowed the Egyptian civilization to happen. Everyone can hear me, right? Fine. Egyptian civilization depended on the Nile flood. Fertility depends on the Tigris and Euphrates flooding, but also the flooding here was unpredictable and violent, unlike the very benign Nile. So it led to a whole different attitude of life. The environment was harsher here and harder than in Egypt, and that led to a different kind of religion, a different kind of mindset for the Mesopotamians versus the religion. The Egyptians had a very cheerful kind of a religious outlook on life and the future. Mesopotamia, it was hard and tough, and the gods weren't pleasant. Well, our story begins with the rise of the Sumerians, begins with civilization, because I can't talk about 10,000 to 12,000 years of Neolithic culture. But by the time the Sumerians arrived, we already had agriculture started. This is another story. Already people were living in homes, mud brick houses. This is during the Neolithic, the last of the Stone Ages. Neolithic is when the glaciers were retreating and people were beginning to move back towards Europe, and the climate was getting better and there was much more water for agriculture, and agriculture began. So did pottery. And what I'm going to show here are a great many slides, even when I don't identify them, they're from the Mesopotamian cultures, what you're seeing. So pottery, already well underway. Some beautiful things. With symbols on them that we may not know often what they mean. This snake is probably not just a snake. It probably has a lot more symbolic importance to the Neolithic people who did it. Well, we don't know. We don't know. It's just beautiful. This has probably a bit more of scope for interpretation. It's something you've all have seen, these what are called fertility goddesses. Why isn't it just a toy? Why isn't it just a figure of a woman that somebody did? Well, it could be. But her genitals are prominently displayed, and she's holding her breasts out. Suggestion of fertility. And people didn't make sculptures lightly. And so there's a whole series of these things from different cultures in the region suggesting that when your agriculture, when you live and die based upon your ability to grow grain, then the gods in charge of agriculture and then the fertility of the earth is everything. And you've got to make sure the earth is going to be fertile, so you've got to ask the gods to please let the crops grow. And fertility, both human and plant fertility, is all part of the earth's abundance. And so fertility is something which is deeply concerning to everyone at the period. Okay, here's a interesting and troubling slide. The Neolithic begins roughly here. Population goes on pretty steady state for a while, Agriculture comes along, boom, a huge increase in population, and it continues to rise because we now can feed ourselves with excess food available, and it rises quite agreeably until we get to us. This is about the Renaissance. This is about the Enlightenment here, when suddenly medical care kept us all alive longer, and suddenly, and there we are, and cut back on diseases, and that's where we're headed now. But we're back for this class. We're back here. The Sumerians. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they came from, but there they are. They suddenly appeared on the scene. I'll show you where exactly in a second. As an accomplished people. This is not a primitive woman. She's obviously got class and stature and a good deal of self-possession. But she's mysterious because we don't really know the heritage of these people. But we do know they suddenly appeared on the scene at the mouth of the Gulf here. Again, the rivers, you see the rivers don't quite meet. In modern times, the shoreline is down here. Shows you how much topsoil has been washed from our activities upstream. But here, down here, in lower part of Iraq, is where the Sumerians appeared. And the Sumerians are our heritage. The Sumerians are what gave us civilization. Starting with the plow. Very simple thing, but suddenly it's a lot easier than poking with a stick in the ground. And although you would simply use a stick first, but if you got more, you want to make more grain, more plowing, you need something to help you out, a little bit of technology, which is a plow, because then you can tie something to the plow and you can domesticate an animal. Not that the animals always want to be domesticated. By this time, dogs had moved in with us because, hey, they like us. And the cats had moved in with us because, hey, we're the best thing that ever happened to a cat. Oxen, who are pretty, and sheep and goats. In fact, goats were probably the first of the livestock to be domesticated. They came in pretty because they're pretty good. They're herding animals and they're pretty placid. So are horses are herding animals, but they're a bit more wild-spirited. But it took some convincing to domesticate them. But once they got on board, they're on board. So now you have a means by which you can pull the plow, and it's a lot easier using an onager than it would be to use an oxen, who's a lot cheaper for one thing. Onagers are easier to maintain and cheaper on the market than oxen. Onagers are wild asses of the plains. They still exist out in the mountains of Iraq and the Near East. Pottery was, as I say, was already up and running. But one thing, so the Sumerians gave us the plow, they gave us the potter's wheel. And the potter's wheel suddenly made it possible to make pots. As many of you have probably done pottery. It made pots a lot more available to everybody, which was a real boon to civilization. Of course, immediately after that, the wealthy people decided, well, if everyone can have a pot, I don't want a pot. So stoneware became popular among those who had a little bit of money, just to make themselves different from the common people. And pots, when they became more and more abundant, got less and less decorated because they were throwing them out rapidly and didn't bother to make them special. But anyway, pottery, about 3500 BCE. And I use BCE instead of just BC, with apologies to this being Sunday morning, to Christianity. We're trying to get away from before Christ, because for worldwide usage of the term, let's say before the Common Era. Same numbers. We're still talking about 0 year, or before the Christian era, or before the Common Era, BCE. Another thing you can do with a spinning wheel, of course, is go somewhere. This is a bit anachronistic. Actually, the technology is really bad here. I don't think these things would stay on. The wheel appeared at the same time as a potter's wheel. We don't know if the potter's wheel led to someone thinking, hey, it's good, we can turn it on the side, or whether somebody began rolling things, which is more likely, and then decided, if this thing that I'm rolling my cart on a wheel, I can turn this on sideways and spin a pot on it. Anyway, about the same time these two things appeared, the idea of the wheel in both uses. And of course the wheel had, for First you take a tree trunk and you slice it off and take a round thing and turn it on its side and off you go. Two problems. One, Mesopotamia doesn't have trees. Even then it didn't have trees. So, I mean, not many. So hard, you had scrub trees, but you didn't have trees big enough to make a decent wheel with that kind of diameter. So they ended up, it was hard to do that. But you started off with a whole wheel. And then, because of the lack of trees, after a couple hundreds of years, you began developing planked wheels where you didn't need large trees. You could just put it together with a series of planks, and therefore smaller wood sections could make a larger wheel. And then, by about 2000 BCE, making the wheel, the whole point was making it light. This wheel breaks a lot more than that wheel, but it's a hell of a lot lighter and a hell of a lot easier to get. The poor old onager is having to haul this thing. It's much easier on the animal, much easier on everybody else. You have a lightweight wheel with spokes. But that Sumerians gave us the wheel. But it all comes back again to agriculture. Agriculture is really the driving force. The pot, the wheel, the plow, these things all were basically to do with agriculture. Even the pot was a place to store the grains and to store the products of the food, mostly for food usage. And oils and things, but all it had to go back to agriculture. And agriculture meant mostly wheat, of which there were wheat, barley, emmer, spelt, other kinds of grains, different places used at different times. But wheat still done, probably as this woman's doing it. She's harvesting by hand in the field. This is we with a giant, vast, thousands of acres of Kansas with these big combine harvesters. You know, that's cheating really, because this is the hard way to do it. And thus we outcompete the whole world with our vast, we in Canada dominate the world because they can't produce it at the kind of cost per acre that we can. The most important, I mean, the obvious foods you all know. Olives, olive oils, barley, which you make beer and other things, and fruits, such. The most important non-edible product was flax. And that's how you made clothing. Clothing either was out of wool or flax. No cotton yet. No, cotton's a long way down the road. And so flax clothing, which doesn't take dye very well. So many of these old images, you see people in white or off-white, because flax doesn't take dye well. Well, what launched civilization, now we're getting towards civilization, but one key, the difference between uncivilized and civilized for an archaeologist is the presence of an urban culture. The presence of people who can't support themselves. That's it. We're getting away from, the farmer can support himself. He grows his food, he eats his food. He makes his own tools, he's good shape. But the minute you begin to have cities, now you have whole classes of people, like 95% of the people in the room, who can't support themselves, who aren't supporting themselves. We're depending on other people to support us, farmers, tool makers, people, the petroleum, whatever it is we need to get by, we depend on other people. And that's the difference. Civilization makes people incapable of supporting themselves. That's the great thing about it. And what started us off on on establishing those classes of people was irrigation. Because you need a surplus of food. If everybody's making only what they can eat, their own family, you're growing what you can eat, there's no surplus, there's nothing excess, and everybody's getting by and supporting themselves. The minute you have a surplus, now you can have people who don't have to farm and still can have food to eat because you have a surplus. And that happened because of irrigation. Those two rivers, to get those river waters away from the banks, if you're along the banks, you have plenty of water. You can just haul water and dump it on your crop. But if you're 2 miles away from the banks, it's hard to get water out there. So irrigation canals. And project works. Organizing people together. First place, we're in villages anyway. We ceased being nomadic when we had crops because you had to be there to plant the crop. You had to be there to harvest the crop. So villages began because we had crops. And now we have these villages. Well, how can we increase the crops? The villagers all get together and dig canals. And somebody's got to organize this, or it seems. We're not very good at committees. We said, committee together, we all argue. Somebody says, no, Tomorrow, we do so-and-so canal. Right, boss, and off we go. The beginnings of hierarchy and leadership and selecting one energetic person in a group to lead the project started out with irrigation. And here's a lovely, this is from a bit later, but it's the best map we have of the Babylonians actually, the Assyrians actually drawing where they wanted their irrigation canals to go and who owned the fields in between. The fields of the priests, the divination priests. The fields, the temples owned a lot of land. The field of the god, that was also, by the way, run by the temples. But the other people owned other fields. And this is all being recorded in the town records. And so you have irrigation. Irrigation, this is one theory about how organized society began. It began with irrigation. That's been, of course, archaeologists will argue about this, but that's one notion. And so the beginnings of cities, because the minute you irrigate, you have a surplus. You get this surplus, what do you do with the surplus? You can you let it sit there, the rats will get it. The rain will fall on it. No, you got to protect it. You have to guard it, you have to enclose it, you have to fend off the rats, and you need somebody to do that. You have to hire somebody to do that. Now you've got an organization beginning. Somebody's got to record. If you have people who spend their lives making pots and not growing, or people who spend their lives becoming scribes and not growing crops, you have to allocate them a certain amount of food. How much? Well, somebody's got to become and start taking records. So you begin the bureaucracy. And so you have the guy who's organizing the projects begins organizing not only irrigation projects, but he's organizing other kinds of projects. He becomes, quote, a leader and a town leader. And you ask him the two other things. How about road? We need a road over here, boss. Okay, well, let's go organize a road. And so they make a road. And then and when you have a surplus, and the town and the village over there on the hill doesn't have a surplus because their land isn't nearly as good, what's their solution? They come over and take your surplus. There's a theory that all war began as organized raids to get the goods that somebody else has and we don't have. Especially in Mesopotamia, the Elamites and these folks up on the mountains didn't have good topsoil like these folks had. They're living very primitive up here. So they look down here and these guys have all these nice houses and all this food to eat, and they're beginning to get lovely pots. These guys don't have the money for it, so what do? They come down and attack. So now you've got to defend yourself. So you have to organize guys to defend you. And these guys are organizing guys to do the raiding. So civilization begins, warfare begins right at the beginning and coming out of this surplus. So the cities grew slowly. It took 5,000 years to go from village to the first city. The first village to the first city. We go back 9,000 BCE for Jericho, perhaps the first city, but that's a little bit outside of our area. But this is Iraq now, and these are the great cities that built up with these hierarchies beginning of all these different levels of bureaucracy to control the surplus and to distribute the surplus. This is Eridu, which is probably the first city, is based on current thinking in this area. Here's what it used to look like. From here to there, spreading out to the horizon. This is, of course, wildly speculative. No one really knows. But this is an educated guess of what the city might have looked like. Here is famous which has been excavated a good deal. You can see Eridu hadn't. Even the ziggurat has been partially rebuilt. But here's now, and then, with the ziggurat there and all these administrative buildings. Uruk, the great city of Gilgamesh, another one of the earliest cities. Possibly looked like that. Buildings both for administration and religious purposes. So now you've got the village has become huge. The village is now full of people who aren't farming and need the food nonetheless. And so the farmers bring their stuff and how do you distribute the food? Well, people buy and sell, but there's no money yet. So you're buying and selling and trading by barter. I've got 6 pots. How many vegetables will 6 pots buy me? The farmer needs pots. You need vegetables. You barter. The king is collecting taxes from people, from farmers and others, by a certain percentage of their crops, and then stores it. and then uses that to distribute out to others. And so without money, goods are going back and forth. But it all comes back again to agriculture and pleasing the gods. Here's the grain goddess. Now look what the grain goddess is doing. She's sitting on, you can't tell really unless you study this, she's sitting on stores of grain and distributing plants. And look, the stuff's growing from her. She's clearly the goddess of grain. And this is probably the farmer god, or he would be the farmer god. And assistants also involved in agriculture. He's also sprouting things. He's carrying a plow. So you have this early religious symbol of who you had to worship in order to get the crops to grow, and how it happened, how the grain goddess helped farmers by helping the farmer god distribute the goods of farming, the techniques of farming. Kings. And so now you've begun the time of kings. The all-powerful rulers who ran the whole show, because we started out by electing them to help organize these small projects, and then they got more and more power, and we kept saying it's easier, if I want something done, I don't have a lot of power myself to do it, but he does. So I'm going to go have him do it for me, and thus we put these people in powerful positions, which are great when they're working for us, very bad when they're not supporting what we want to support. But we have a series of kings. We begin to get the names of kings in these documents, in these clay documents, who these kings were. And of course, being king, they began collecting wealth. And it isn't only because they were more powerful and they took it away from us and we grumbled but we couldn't fight it. We often were happy to see the king wealthy because it implied the whole country was wealthy. And we have a way of following this great alpha male figure, which sometimes does us a very bad turn. But they come out of the grave sites here with these incredible hoards of wealth. That's not incredible by medieval standards, but it's not bad by beginning of civilization standards. Gold, because gold is beautiful. What about the poor guys at the bottom? Here's mom and dad and the 3 kids. Very abstracted, but there they are. Well, guess who ended up at the bottom of the totem pole when the hierarchy began distributing the goods? The farmer. The farmer who started it all, who made everybody else wealthy, now found himself one of the lowest members of society, above slaves, but pretty low on the totem pole in terms of respect and the redistribution of goods. And the king would take a great deal of the products of the farmer away from him and then give back some things what the farmer needed, but only in small amounts. So the farmer found himself suddenly out of the power pyramid very quickly. Well, over hundreds of years, even a few thousand years. Well, so you have these major cities beginning and the Sumerian civilization. The one thing I have mentioned the military, the beginnings of military. Well, the first thing these kings were able to do was to establish consistently. I mean, before you'd see the guys coming over the hill to raid you, and you'd gather everybody together like the embattled farmers of the American Revolution, and they'd all go out there and they'd defend their crops or defend the surplus, and then they'd go away or they'd lose. Now the king says, oh no, we need established military. We need guys whose full job is more guys who aren't earning their own keep anymore. Guys established military whose job it is to defend us. And so we begin to see in the Sumerians chariots. There are the solid wheels. See, it's 2 halves. We haven't even got to planked wheels yet. This is pretty early. Soldiers, there they are marching. Chariots. And here are some chariots with people under them, indicating that the enemy has been vanquished. So we have this box with the Sumerian army, the first indications of an army. And if you look at these guys, well, I'll show you. Here are these guys we just saw. Here is a grave where these are copper helmets they're wearing, where a copper helmet was found still on the skull, somewhat crushed. So that's why it's crushed out this direction, but it was probably looking something like that at first. These guys were buried in the tomb with the king to defend him in the next world. And so their weapons, you have an idea what they used to fight with, these axes, which are very similar. Farmers' tools were turned into weapons. These things began as farmers' tools and became weapons. But the one guy who suddenly became the most important person next to the king himself, was the scribe. But in order for the scribe to be important, we have to establish some sort of notation. So that's Dudu, the scribe. That's his name. It's written on the back of it in ancient Sumerian. Note the costume. This is a lot of these formal portraits, formal sculptures we will see, are in these woolen, tufted wool, heavy tufted wool dresses, you might call them. I don't know what you would call them. They're called kanakis, but I'm not sure in modern terms what you call them. And with the upper body bare, because it is hot, and yet this is still worn. The scribe, it begins by using marks to indicate trade, to indicate how many cows and sheep I'm giving to you and how many bundles of barley you're going to give to me. And we mark this thing down with certain marks on clay. But other things were necessary. To know agriculture, to know when to plant, to know what the gods are doing, you have to know astrology, I mean astronomy. You have to know what the skies are saying, because the skies will say certain things at certain times of year, as you know, and they'll give you the clues as to how you should act as a farmer, when you should plant, when you should harvest, and what to expect. And also you can tell by watching the stars when the floods might be coming. And somebody's got to be able to put this down. So we began a class of people who were putting these marks down and keeping these records. This is a sky map, 3300 BCE. Sumerian sky map. Here is in the trade, because all these towns are trading with each other. Trade was going on even before agriculture. I've got good pots here. That person 100 miles away doesn't have good clay, they can't make good pots. He wants my pots. What he has is animal skins from the mountains he brings, and we trade. Well, here's a scribe marking down. He's not texting on his iPod. He's marking. Notice how we've gone back. Exactly, it's the same thing now. He's got bales of what looks like wool there, and sacks of grain, and he's recording these because the king wants to know how much we're producing and where it's going. And also the different merchants want to know. So if you're a merchant and I've got several bushels of several bales of wool, and I'm going to sell it to someone 100 miles away, it could get stolen on the way here and there, so I have to mark down how many bales on a tablet, enclose the tablet, put a security seal on it, and off it goes with the bales, so the guy at the other end cracks it open, because he can't read either, because only scribes could read, so he gets a scribe over, scribes are hanging around the marketplace in a little booth waiting for to be called for a fee to read these things. And so the scribe will get this, and he'll break it open, okay, right, it says here, six bales. 1, 2, 3, okay, good. Wait, there's only 5 bales here, and then then he goes back and contacts what happened. Somebody stole a bale along the way, robbers came in. You have to settle these things, but the contracts were handled by the scribes. So scribes worked for the king, and they also worked for private merchants who could hire them and also individuals to write letters. I'll get that in a second. Here is outside of some guys sewing. But not in the temple, but next to the temple, in the government buildings, are scribes who know exactly how many cattle you have, exactly how much seed he's given you to allow you to plant, and how much your yield is going to be. So the farmers, the scribes, now you've got an administration which is carefully watching everything everyone in the country is doing. So already we've got this vast government apparatus. It happened pretty quickly in historic times to control everything that's happening in the country as best they can. Here's a trading network. Here's some of the roads. Because at the same time that this is happening, right here, this is happening, Egypt. Mesopotamia is ahead of Egypt, but not by much. And the old kingdom of Egypt is now beginning to peak right in Egypt. And so there's trade going back all the way through Iran, Iraq. There's metals. Up here, metalworking began. And so they didn't start metalworking, but they quickly picked up the idea of making bronze, one of the major movements of Western civilization. So what we have down here is excellent topsoil, good crops, lots of grain, bitumen, which a tar, which is used for caulking and for waterproofing, and expertise at pottery and things. Up here, they have metals. Here, very important, are the nearest decent trees. The great cedars of Lebanon, which became a hot product for a couple thousand years before we, of course, cut them all down. But cedars of Lebanon were a major export for the Lebanese, import for the Phoenicians who were there later, imports for the Mesopotamians. And again, as these goods were going along, not only was how many bales of something was, but how much weight of olive oil, how much weight of something. So you needed to compare weights. And so you have scales and standardized weight scales to know how much things weighed, and also how much you would pay sometimes with precious metals, with a bit of silver. And you have to weigh the silver. So I'm selling you something, you're paying me with silver, but this is worth, 60 minas or a shekel and a half. Those are weights. It's also used for money. That's why shekel means money and weight, because it originally was based on the weight. And then so you have to weigh this much silver, and you have some accurate way to weigh this. And so you'd have scales, the balance scale used in the marketplace to weigh the incoming and outgoing products using these basic weights, counterweights, and to record it, language. Now, everyone had spoke, but written language begins, again, the Mesopotamians beginning to write language. You start off with indicating a symbol on this clay tablet how much you're using. I mean, what the product is. I'm selling you fish. I'm selling you an ox. The contract is for an ox, so you add put a symbol of an ox. And then to make it easier to get more on the tablet, you make it vertical. You still know that's a duck, a bird. And then you begin to use, this is still awkward, but this is not, because you had a standardized writing implement that you can now tell what exactly you're using, what exactly it is, and everyone has the same writing implement to suddenly standardize things, because my duck doesn't look like your duck, and putting a picture of a duck on the thing may cause arguments. It looks like a cow to me. But here is the cuneiform stylus. It's just a stick with a wedge on one end and a round part on the other. And with that, you make these. The round point is for numbers. You can indicate numbers, groups of 10. The wedge is for the actual letters, so you've got this kind of thing happening using the wedges, cuneiform meaning wedge shape. And there's the word for king, using these wedges. And now you can make documents, and you can record things. It gets very complicated in terms of getting verbs into verbs and adjectives and such. That comes down the road. But we start off with just objects, nouns. There's Dudu again. And here he is in school. The scribe is crucial. The economy doesn't work without the scribe. The scribe is like the computer now. Everything goes through it, and without it, everything collapses. But only tiny percentage, only a few hundred scribes in any big city. Less, 0.001% of the population can read. Only the scribes can read. Sometimes the priests will go to scribe school because so they can read their prayers and write prayers. But usually, most cases, only the scribes who could read, and only a few hundred of them in any place. And so everything going and coming had to go through the scribes. So it's a very prestigious thing to do, send your kid off to scribal school. And we have lovely documents about scribes, about the kids complaining about school and saying they hate school, or complaining about how the teacher beat them, or whatever. But it's a plum job if you can survive scribal school. And it's a very privileged position, as I say, and you're quite smug about it. Here's a sales contract for a field and a house. And these are marks of how many. Those round parts are multiples of 10. These are individuals. So there's 5 something or another. I've got in a longer class, I have a legend as to what some of these symbols mean. But 5 of these, 30 of those, so you have an indication of how much the contract would be for it to sell this piece of property, piece of farm property. And as I said, writing letters. Here's a letter with an envelope. So if you don't want, you can write your letter right on a tablet, but then everybody, all the other scribes can read it. And sometimes someone could actually change it. So to secure the letter or to secure the contract, you would put it in an envelope. And then so there's a letter, there's a clay envelope, and right here is a stamp. A person's stamp indicating the sender's name. It's like the address stamp. Dictionaries. Once you got scribes on the staff, you can do all kinds of things. Say, hey, let's make a word list. So when Akkadian language came in, the scribes began comparing Akkadian words versus Sumerian words and making dictionaries just for the palace records for other scribes to use to decipher documents. And here's the cylinder seal that everyone had. It's stone, about this big, and it's got a hole in it. So you normally wore it on your neck on a thread. And you'd roll it onto clay. Here it's rolled onto sand. Picture of the storm god, Adad there, and with text, cuneiform writing. So you'd roll that onto your document or onto your letter or whatever to identify who you were. Stonework. One thing beautiful about the Sumerians was the quality of their stone as well as the quality of their pots. Gypsum, here's a woman, obviously a woman with some class. Her hair's done up very nicely. There probably would have been valuable, small valuable stones in her as eyes in the original statue. This is an astonishing piece. Limestone carved as this muscular lioness. This piece recently sold for the highest sales price of any ancient piece of sculpture. I think it went for $50 million. It's about this big. No, 8 inches, about that big. Yeah. But it's a stunning piece of work. This is not bad either. This is now silver. This is in the Met in New York. And it's a religious, so it's a libation, so you pour out the libation oil in the religious ceremony from the spout here, and this is just to hold it. But it's a beautiful piece of work of a woman with ox head or an ox woman. Simple things, which jewelers often use to imitate, and more complex things. Here's a ram in a thicket, or eating in thicket. It's an incredibly complex, using lapis lazuli, gold, silver, wood, all manner of inlay. It's just an amazing piece. There are 2 of these, one's in Philadelphia and one's in London. Fashion, the women, of course, when they had a little money, when the hierarchy of society began, the women began to looking for high fashion. Her hair is done up, tied around, and tied behind her. This is found in a tomb of a queen, and this is one of her attendants. This isn't the queen. All of these things might have been, I mean, any woman of class might have worn some of these bead chains and some of these lapis lazuli and gold jewelry, and even a headdress perhaps like that. Probably wouldn't all be on this one person unless she was the attendant to the queen. All on a single model, single person. Here's the queen herself with these leaves of beaten gold. Of course, this was found in her tomb. This wasn't daily wear. This is something she would wear only on high ceremonial occasions and important occasions like her death, like her own funeral. But they've recovered this stuff and shined it up, and there she is, Queen Put Abi. And what you might do in these palaces when you're got some free time, and you probably have a lot of free time if you work for the king, is play games. Starting off, they believe you start off here and roll the dice. They had dice just exactly like ours. Roll dice and move along the board this way and end up here. And the first person to get all their pieces here wins. And probably along the middle way, that's something you could take people out if you landed on them. Something like that. And music. Most music, I mean, the king court would have music for storytelling and for entertainments, but most music was for religious affairs, religious processions. Here's a beautiful harp, a lyre, but probably, it's from her grave, so it's probably a palace thing, but most of these we find are for religious purposes. Likewise, beer drinking. out of straws. Beer was by far the first alcoholic drink. Well, it's believed to be the first alcoholic drink. And it was indulged in for recreational purposes like we do, but also we have religious symbols all over this seal here, the moon god there, indicating that this is probably a religious intoxication, which is a fundamental use of beer and wine, of course, as we still do. So, Sumerians here, and the Akkadians growing up there, and the Akkadians gradually came down, infiltrated, not hostile way, but just gradually took over. They sort of moved in, and pretty soon they were running the show after a couple generations. And we entered the Akkadian period, and the Akkadians brought a different language, a Semitic language. And now the Semites, we begin a Semitic period in the Middle East that stays Semitic for the rest of the time. And the Akkadian language becomes the basic language of the whole region after a while. A couple of Akkadian rulers down the line, it was the most famous, Sargon, who being the most powerful ruler of this period and of this whole millennium, has lots of legends associated with him, one of which he was found as a baby in the bulrushes in the river. Like Moses. This was 800 years before Moses. But it's a good story because it's a good way to identify the divine origin of this baby. So the baby appears, you know. And the daughter of the king finds the baby and brings it into the palace, and thus and he becomes the king. This is not him, but it's from his period. It used to be thought it was to be him, more likely his grandson. One thing about Sargon is that his daughter became high priestess and Hedwana, and she is the first known author in all of human history. We have her name attached to hymns. She became high priestess, and she wrote hymns and became the first person who's known to be an author. We have texts older than that, stories told by, it's written down, but no author attached. This is the first author we know of, was in Hedwana. And Sargon's empire, called the first empire, those phrases don't really mean a lot because it's hard to say what you call or don't call an empire. But it was a significant chunk of land. Notice that everybody, you will notice that everybody in this region follows the Fertile Crescent. This is desert. Nobody wants it. And besides which, there are brigands in there. So when you conquer and civilize, you follow the fertile land up here and then around the corner along the coast, going down into Egypt. Sargon, his empire required enslaving a great many people, and the slave economy became important in Mesopotamia. Here are prisoners of war with ladders, wooden ladder-like constrictions around their neck being marched off. Here's what I'm saying about the Fertile Crescent. Actually, the Fertile Crescent includes this. This is all also very rich land. But at the same time, here's Sumerians, starting 3200 BC, or that's where they were at 3200. They started earlier. The Akkadians came in about there, Sargon. And the Akkadian Empire includes most of this. At the same time is the old kingdom of Egypt. The pyramids are being done. As Sargon is marching, the pyramids are just brand new. So that's to compare what's happening in these two great centers of civilization. Much of this civilization, such as metalworking, such as writing, such as the wheel, probably learned from them. It appeared here slightly later than it did there. The Akkadians, again became the dominant people, and their language, even after they faded away, their language remained the dominant language of the region. Gudea, you find him in a lot of museums because he put a statue of himself everywhere, all over his kingdom. Every town, every building had a statue of Gudea in it. His wife also got her images around. We believe that's her wife. We can't really be sure. She's wearing a very nice shawl. She's dressed well for someone who wasn't the queen. And the great city of that period, Lagash, up top. Speculative entirely. Below Lagash now. The Euphrates River has moved 20 miles away. From here, it flows by town. The Euphrates River moved, the town dried up. The Gulf headed south 120 miles further away. And it used to be right next to the Gulf. The river right here opened onto the Gulf. Now it's just out in the middle of nowhere and shows it. And it hasn't been excavated very much. as the Akkadian rulers begin to lose power, other people begin moving in, including nomads. Here's a fellow called Abram, later anointed Abraham, who moves into the region about this time. And Abraham on the move, moving perhaps because of the decline of these great empires. So he follows the Fertile Crescent along. Briefly, a look at the gods, because this is probably the strangest thing of this story for us. And it all begins with grain. There's the grain goddess. Again, she's sitting on grain. She's offering the gift of grain. These horns mean God. So these are all minor goddesses she's giving the grain to. Gift of grain. In other words, the gift of agriculture. The chief god was called An, the sky god. He had no real activity. He just sort of sat there. He was just overarching sky. So we don't have a whole lot of him doing much. The active principle was Enlil, Lord Storm. He was what made things happen. He's what brought the storms. He's what brought major changes. He's what caused disruptions in the atmosphere. And when a foreign army comes sweeping down and attack you, they said Enlil's. The wave of Enlil is coming down. It was always, he was associated with all kinds of powerful motions that the great sky god didn't do. So Enlil was the enforcer. He was the testosterone of the pantheon of gods. Enki was the quiet water god, god of fresh waters, god of wisdom. Waters run deep, Enki ran deep. You see that you always knew it was him because you got fish flowing off him. But he was wisdom and waters, and he appears in many stories as a kind of almost Promethean figure, helping mankind out. We may have run into Inanna Ishtar. She's the tough lady. She's love perhaps, but more sex than love. Sexual passion, sexual power. And she's involved in many stories. Here you can tell a major god by the multiple horned helmet. And there's a minor goddess coming to worship her and her pet dog, her pet lion. This is how you keep a lion docile. But that's not very docile. Anyway, that's her lion. And her powers on her back. And her star, the Venus star, evening star. And there's many stories associated with Ishtar, including the descent of Ishtar, which has been a very popular thing in modern times. Women's studies look at which she goes to the underground, and she goes to the underground and goes through seven unveilings, and there's a whole story about her trip to the underground, which takes us into all the great underground resurrection stories of this region. And one of the first of the great resurrection stories is Dumuzi, or Tammuz, where she comes down, and it's very hard to sort this story out, but there's something about him being resurrected coming out of it. And here he is rising out of the ground. His resurrection, which became necessary for the resurrection of the year. We've just passed the winter solstice, and so these resurrection stories, the gods of resurrection, the sun's heading south. It's got to come back. If the sun doesn't come back our direction, we're all going to die. The sun is going south every autumn. And so we had the big festival in midwinter saying, please come back. And the sun's okay, the sun comes back. And if you don't do the festival, the sun doesn't come back, and we die. This is very crucial. This is life or death stuff. And so every agricultural society has a god who dies and is reborn. The death and resurrection birth. And Osiris in Egypt, it's Inanna and Dumuzi, or Tammuz, in Mesopotamia. Shamash was the sun god. He was the guy who had to be coaxed back. He was the god of justice, because the sun sees all. And so Shamash he carries a saw by which he cuts justice fairly. There's the rays rising off of him because he is the sun god. And there he is stepping over the mountain in the morning. This is dawn as the sun god comes over the mountain. And he's also a wise god because he's just. And he helps Gilgamesh on his way in his great story. All manner of stories one has found on these tablets. We can't tell them here. In the beginning, all the world floated on fresh water, Abzu. And it all happened in Bahrain. This is the satellite of Bahrain. That was the land of fresh and salt water together for them. Bahrain was some distance away down in the Persian Gulf, but it was where their stories of creation began, where creation began for them. And the creation story ends with this god Marduk. This is Tiamat. She is salt water. She's a very fearsome thing there. But she's defeated by Marduk. The original story didn't have Marduk in the story. It ended with Tiamat and creation happening through a whole series of other events. But the Assyrians, 1,000 years later, took the story, changed it, and had Marduk win. The Babylonians, essentially, had Marduk win this great war, and he's their chief god. So they changed the creation story to allow a victory of their god. So what we get now, the story we get now, is a story of Marduk winning this great battle. And there's the temple to Marduk in Babylon, a model of that temple. And it shows that the place of worship, the center of the god's power, the chief god of the city, was always this ziggurat. This is called the ziggurat. It's a stepped mountain, essentially, a pyramid. And you see people like the Mayans, the people love to do pyramids. In Asia as well, Barabdabur, and that's these pyramids, representing a kind of man-made mountain by which we honor the gods by giving them this mountain. Here is the ziggurat of Ur to the moon god. And this is what they found before they began excavating it and renovating it. There's the guys climbing up it there. Here's Ur, and there's the folks climbing up it now. This is speculation of what it might have looked like. But Ur was pretty complete, so we can get a pretty good guess at it. Temple of Ishtar in Babylon, here's a model of it. And sacred processions going to these temples. The sacred marriage of Inanna. The king, in some cases, in some societies, had to marry the goddess of fertility, or the goddess of resurrection, which meant actually he and the high priest went and slept together for the night. And their intercourse allowed the crops to come back every year. So the king, it's a sacred marriage, his whole procession where the king would be processed and he'd meet the high priestess who was standing in for Inanna, who is embodying Inanna, then off they'd go for their sex. And that would allow the crops to happen again next year. And heroes. The most famous one, of course, is Gilgamesh, a book everyone should have on their shelves, a fabulous story, the first great story, the story that begins the whole hero's journey idea of stories. And the stories that were told, as Homer was 1,500 years later, or almost 2,000 years later, by bards. Here, we saw that harp before with the head of an ox, and there it is again, by bards playing and singing these great stories. And worship. What the common people would do would be worship and pray to the gods, not only to the chief gods, but there's all manner of gods. There's gods everywhere you look. Because every animate thing you don't have a god of water, but you have a god of a chair. You have gods of table salt. You have gods of foodstuffs. You have gods of the building. You have everything that had power to do something had a spirit in it, had a sacred spirit that had to be talked to. So you talk to your food, and you talk to the trees. You talk to your house. Everything that did something for you, had a power to affect you, had to be talked to, because it too was a conscious, sentient being. And so it leads to a kind of paranoia. Here, and these are praying figures. So in graves, you put a praying figure they put a praying figure in with you in the grave of you, eternally praying to the God. So these figures will be prayed for all eternity in behalf of the body, so that the gods would be pleased of you in the next life. So many of the figures I've shown you are figures of praying images put in the graves so that the gods will think well of you, and you're honoring the gods continually in the next life. This is a collection of them put on a museum shelf from different graves. Here are women praying, again, from in a funerary context to the gods, worshipfully. And you had some of every disease had a god associated with it. And there were all kinds of gods associated with death of children. And of course, more than half of children never made it to adulthood. So mothers are constantly praying to the gods, spare my child, spare my child. If you caught a cold, there's someone to deal with. There's something to deal with if you don't have a cold, just until you don't get a cold. Broken legs, toothache. You can buy entire books in the libraries, in bookstores, of these spells translated in English, spells for toothache, spells for flatulence, spells for hearing loss, for hair loss. It's all in. I mean, everything had a spell. You're talking to some god. Here's a god in charge of a pestilent winds. When the wind comes in and makes you ill. Pazuzu was a god of that, a fearsome-looking fellow that you had to pray to. They were also benevolent gods to protect you. When you go to the New York Met Museum, you find a room protected. The king's palace was always protected by these great Lamassu figures, these giant oxen with men's heads that were benign, protective figures. This, we don't even know what that was, but it seems protective of a god. You can tell it's a god because he's got this multiple horned helmet on top, but in the form of a bull. Here's a god whose job it was to protect people who were vulnerable on the toilet when everyone is really vulnerable. So to protect you while you're on the John, this god was there and would be in the toilet bathroom for you. Other ways in which you had to evoke the gods was find out what the gods intend. And divination. You can divinate all kinds of divination. If someone walks in the room with red hair, it's a sign. If a certain flight of birds comes by, it's a sign. And you had experts who knew what the signs meant. And you had to consult them. And they were crucial. And sheep's livers were, of course, consulted as the Greeks did much later even, intestines. And here is a clay model of a liver, as you can see, for students to practice. So they'd give them these, rather than actually waste entire sheep, they'd give you these clay models, and the students would have to figure out, a bump here meant this, a shape of this lobe here meant that, and the professor would say, yeah, okay, and they test the students on how well they could divine based upon this study liver. And at the bottom of it all, literally, at the base of it all, down deep in the underground, was Urkala, or Ereshkigal, who was the goddess of the underworld, a fearsome woman. That's the woman who Inanna goes down and meets, who happens to be her sister, of course, who meets during the descent to the underworld of Inanna, and she has her owls there. Well, what we have is the Akkadians die off and the Assyrians develop. First, the Assyrian Empire is right here, and the Assyrian Empire lasts a couple hundred years. You see it there, 1800 to 1600 BC, the first Assyrian Empire, and then the power turns to Babylon, where I have to get to him, Hammurabi, who rises up in Babylon. Here's Assur, and there's Babylon, which we hadn't heard of before. These towns have now fallen out of power, and Babylon becomes the great power led by Hammurabi. Here's a map of the world come from Babylon, with Babylon at the center of the world, and the ocean of the world around it, the mountains outside the ocean, and the marsh near the mouth of the Arabian Gulf here. And so you have the Babylonians, as all of us do, tend to think of ourselves as the center of the world. At that point, it probably was. And one guy who thought so was Hammurabi, who had this thing put up in towns all around his realm. You can't see it on this. It's 7 foot tall, but this is all text. All written in cuneiform. All the code of Hammurabi, the laws. It's not the first law, because there were earlier laws, but this is the most important early legal code. And it wasn't an exact code of what you must not do, what was illegal, but it was a code of statements and consequences, of actions and consequences, trying to establish a kind of order to society. And at the top is Hammurabi himself talking to Shamash, who has said Shamash, the sun god, was the god of justice. And so Shamash is up there giving the law code to Hammurabi and saying to him, it's written, saying to him, I'm giving you this code for the proper worship of me. And Hammurabi has a text saying to his people, this isn't my law, it's his. I'm his conduit. This is the law we have to follow because the god says so. So you have in the Hammurabi's code. And when they found this actually in the Elamite city, where the Elamites had come down, attacked Babylon, and stolen the pillar. They came in to steal the law code. Not to steal riches, but to steal the law code. That's really how important the law code was, how important the king thought the law code would be. And we end up with, I could go on forever, but we end up with Babylonian Empire, which went this far. Babylon falls. Assyria expands and takes over. And so with Assyria now running 1500 to the second running, or actually the third running of the Assyrian Empire, 1500 to 600, ends up controlling the whole landscape here until about 603, when Babylon rises again under our old friend Nebuchadnezzar, who then takes over. The Assyrian Empire collapses. Nebuchadnezzar takes over the whole thing. He captures the Jews, takes them back to Babylon, where they, in their spare time, where for 50 years the Babylonian captivity allows them to essentially create the Jewish religion and give it its final form, or give it its first solid form. And then Babylon falls to the Persians in about 512, and that's the end of it. Because the Persians are from here, not Mesopotamia anymore. So when the Persians come in, conquer Babylon, let the Jews go back to Damascus. The Greeks are just beginning Greek society here. We're now beginning to advance upon the great period of Greece, and Mesopotamia is over, because the Persians are not Mesopotamians, and never again does Mesopotamia have a period of self-rule, not until modern times. So that's a very quick summation of Mesopotamian civilization. Thank you very much.